I will begin by acknowledging that I am zooming in to participate in this discussion series from the Wurundjeri land, and that I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge that Australia is built on stolen land and that the sovereignty has never been ceded. So welcome everyone to our April 2021 CERN discussion series. Just a few housekeeping rules. If you can turn off make sure that you're on mute and perhaps turn off your camera so that when the presenters are presenting already, so that we save up the bandwidth. And then another thing is that we are recording this, so please let us know if you would rather not have your camera or yourself being recorded, so that we can make sure of that once we do upload this publicly. And the other thing is that if you do have questions, we will have a Q&A later on. And if you do have questions, you can pop them in the chat function, or you can also raise your hand. All right, so the topic that we are going to have this afternoon finds itself in the intersection of discussion around issues on feminism. So we have two speakers, Kaira, Canete, and Stefan, Lagman. We will begin with Kaira, Canete, and Kaira is a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. She has recently, congratulations, submitted her thesis entitled Becoming Resilient, Disaster Recovery in Post-Yolanda Philippines Through Women's Eyes, which critically investigates Build Back Better reconstruction from a feminist standpoint. The title of her presentation is PhotoKwento, Co-Constructing Women's Narratives of Disaster Recovery. On a side note, if there's one thing that is common among the speakers here and also the facilitators, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Bonita, and together with Reden, we will be facilitating this CERN discussion series. We are both teaching and doing research at the University of Melbourne. I'm with the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and Reden is with the Melbourne School of Design. And like I mentioned, if there's anything common among us, the speakers and the facilitators, that we enjoy plants and farming. So if we have time, we can also ask questions about that. All right, so thank you everyone for joining, and Kaira.
Thank you, Bon, for that introduction. Give me a few seconds to share my screen. Okay, oops. Okay, so thanks so much for inviting me to speak for our discussion for this month, April. I'm grateful to CERN for offering me this space where I can share with you the work that's really close to my heart. I will be talking about PhotoKwento, which is a feminist photo-based method I designed for my PhD research. As Bon mentioned earlier, it examines disaster recovery and reconstruction processes through the eyes of women. Although I've submitted my thesis in December and I'm waiting examination results anytime now. So hopefully in the next few months, pwede na akong magbigay ng reseta. Anyway, so my presentation, so the first part, I will be giving a very brief overview of my research project, and then why I am using photo-based methods for my research design. And the next part will take us through the different stages of how I have implemented PhotoKwento. It's not moving down. Okay, why is my... Okay, there. Sorry about that. So about my research, so I aim to examine women's experiences of disaster reconstruction in Tacloban. So as we all know, Tacloban bore the most damage when Typhoon Yolanda hit the Philippines in November 2013. So as part of efforts to build back better in the wake of the disaster, Tacloban City initiated a large-scale resettlement of some 90,000 people from the coastal danger zones of Tacloban to the northern peripheries of the city. So my interest in post-Yolanda reconstruction stemmed from my personal experience as well of the storm, although I was not located in Tacloban at that time, I was in Cebu. And also my subsequent involvement in disaster response initiatives as a development practitioner with a non-government an NGO that I founded in the Philippines called A2T Project, Research Group for Alternatives to Development. So in addition, my more than 15 years of working with grassroots women's organizations on various human rights and socioeconomic issues, and the production of gender-specific studies as a feminist scholar at the University of the Philippines in Cebu, it created a particular desire in me to understand how gender played an important role in shaping experiences of disaster and in generating differentiated risks and vulnerabilities. So exposure in the field made me reflect critically the complexities of reconstruction, physical relocation, and the negotiations between continuity and change that underpinned all the efforts to build back better, especially from the perspective of women. And so why women? So I employ feminist standpoint theory, and I use women's perspectives as a way to interrogate processes of recovery. So the goal here is not to generate an account of women's experiences of disaster per se, but rather from those experiences, I sought to explore what we might learn or need to unlearn about the ways in which communities are being rebuilt after a disaster. So the figure in this slide describes my methodological approach. It's inspired by an approach called institutional ethnography, which is developed by feminist sociologist Dorothy Smith. So for my study, I engaged with 42 women from 3 selected disaster resettlement sites in Tacloban in order to understand their experiences and perspectives on rebuilding communities, quote unquote, for the better through PhotoKwento. These women belong to urban poor communities in informal settlements and were displaced as a result of the storm surges that destroyed their homes. Due to their displacement, they and their families became beneficiaries of housing reconstruction and resettlement projects that were initiated by the state, international, and local NGOs, as well as the private sector. So as a caveat, when I speak about women, I underscore the importance of thinking about women not as a stable category, but or a homogeneous group, and that their experiences are always shaped and defined by, their life conditions, their circumstances and identities, such as class, age, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. So these were certainly, issues that I considered when I was recruiting women to participate in my study. So my research also addresses an important point made by J.C. Gaylord, who is a prominent disaster studies scholar, in his critical appraisal of disaster scholarship of the last 40 years. Here he highlights how the problems and analyses articulated in dominant disaster studies still tend to privilege Western, technical, and I would also add androcentric knowledges. So this favoring of certain forms of knowledge and ways of conducting research has often erased the voices of those already marginalized from the production of these knowledge systems, especially from those from the global south, thus running the risk of reproducing, perpetuating, or even exacerbating disaster vulnerabilities. So as I developed my methodology, I always referred back to this quote by Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, which I use as an opening for my methods chapter of my thesis. And I always look back to this to continually ground me and remind me of how research is enmeshed in the politics of knowledge, and how from the moment I have identified my question, developed my design, constructed and interpreted my data, my authorial voice as a researcher has already taken hold of the narrative. Thus, I regard method as not simply a means for constructing data to answer a question, but it is always already a practice of politics. So this is where I stand with regard to my subject of inquiry. So with this in mind, let me now move on to the key methodological issues I sought to address with PhotoKwento. Well, a wide range of research tools in both quantitative and qualitative studies have been utilized to draw out insights on different facets of disaster experiences and responses. There remains little critical examination on research methods themselves, which especially engage with issues on the processes and politics through which knowledge is constructed. Drawing insights from feminist theory, methods, and practice, I problematize two issues which can be regarded as starting points for exploring and developing a more grounded, ethical, and politically committed approach to producing knowledge about disaster from below, and more specifically from the global south. So the first methodological issue I identified is power imbalances in researcher-researched relationships in a disaster context. So at present, there is a continuing dominance of research conducted by Western and often male scholars on disasters occurring in the global south. Thus, the production of knowledge is placed in the hands of researchers, according to Gillard, to quote, with limited knowledge of the disaster-affected areas and with insufficient time to collect enough background information to learn the local language and to get to know the local culture, leading regularly to misconceptions. Second, I problematize the kind of tools or mediums of inquiry that are often applied in disaster studies. Specifically, I asked what tools might be useful to capture the complexity of human experiences in a disaster beyond the word-based and often highly technical instruments commonly employed. And I would know this because for the past few years, I've been really engaged in disaster risk management practice. So basically the kinds of instruments that we use are word-based and very technical. Secondly, what techniques might be able to generate more effective narratives and stories, as well as the embodied experiences, relationships to place, and emotions that are actually so central to disaster experiences, yet are often overlooked. More importantly, I asked what research methods might be employed which embody the ethical standpoint for conducting relevant and politically engaged research. So these methodological questions have long been central concerns of feminist scholarship, broadly speaking. But in this presentation, I show how PhotoKwento, which uses photographs in an interview setting, or what we call photo elicitation, engages with the methodological issues I raised. In particular, I highlight how its application in disaster research can contribute to the critical project of co-constructing knowledge with those who have the most at stake in disasters, beginning from the standpoint of marginalized women. So why do I choose a photo-based method? So there are several advantages to photo-based methods. So according to Collier, who basically wrote the introductory book for visual anthropology, photo-based methods have the ability to prod latent memory and to release emotional statements about the informant's life. Second, it can facilitate more in-depth discussion of certain phenomena compared to mainly verbal interviews. Third, using photographs can not only reveal cultural but also affective bonds that people have with their socio-ecological environments. And this is particularly relevant to my work as affect and emotions are quite central to my analysis of disaster reconstruction. And lastly, photo elicitation also potentially facilitates more collaborative engagement with study participants. In relation to this last point, applications of photo elicitation accomplished this by shifting the frame of reference of the research encounter from the perspective of the researcher, us, with our ready set of interview questions and conceptual frameworks, to the dynamic perspectives of various study participants. So the development of PhotoKwento draws on the insights from what might be considered good practices of photo elicitation. However, it is unlike a wide range of photoelicitation methods employed mainly to enhance, first, to enhance analysis and deepen understanding of sociocultural phenomena, such as what Collier has done or Douglas Harper in visual anthropology, or to reveal perspectives of marginalized or less powerful groups, especially youth and children, or to amplify voices of the marginalized to promote a particular advocacy, such as the more widely known photo voice. Rather, what sets PhotoKwento apart is that it focuses on rethreading and interweaving small stories of a particular experience, in this case, a disaster, which shaped the bigger story of carving out post-disaster futures. It combines the significant elements embodied by various photo-based methods, but emphasizes the interconnectedness of stories and the people who produce them in order to counter the persistent silences around political, economic, and ecological issues that form the basis for gendered inequalities, disempowerment, and disadvantage aggravated by the experience of disasters. So this particular characteristic of PhotoKwento resonates well with decolonial feminist politics, which promotes knowledge production from the margins as a site of nurturing possibilities for transformation. So now we move to how did I implement PhotoKwento? So PhotoKwento is inspired in particular by the research of Bunster and Cheney in 1989 on experiences of working women in Lima, Peru. So dubbed as the talking pictures interviews, their method is broadly composed of 3 stages: taking photographs of women's daily activities using a Polaroid camera. Second, involving women through a photo elicitation meeting in the selection of photographs and development of the interview tool, which is a photo album. And third, interviewing working women using the photo album that was previously compiled. Now, PhotoKwento adopts the general approach of Bunster and Cheney, as seen in this figure, but it also introduces some fundamental variations to the techniques and the processes employed. As with many photo-based methods, the decision to use a particular visual production tool is based on a number of factors such as time and budgetary constraints, access to technology, and so on. Bunster and Cheney used Polaroid cameras in their study, which captured and printed images almost simultaneously. For PhotoKwento, I provided point-and-shoot digital cameras, which allowed for the generation of more images and offered better storage options for use and analysis in the future. So in light of their preview functions, this type of tool would accord participants with an opportunity to review and reflect on the photographs that they have taken. In the context of this research, this was a critical process that permitted participants to think about the stories that they wanted to tell with their photographs, as well as to contemplate and assess their emotions, thoughts, and reactions towards the image and the process of producing such visuals. The second main difference is that while researchers accompanied women and took pictures of their everyday lives during the Bunster and Cheney project, my study opted to supply cameras to 12 women for a span of 1 week to the in 3 study sites, and requested that they take photographs without me. So this is what we call participant-generated images. So the choice to utilize researcher-generated images was in Bunster and Cheney's work was influenced by certain considerations concerning cultural appropriateness. However, in my own work, I made an epistemological decision to grant participants more control over what images they wanted to capture as relevant to their specific experiences, as well as where and when they wish to do so. So given the degree of involvement of the participants, additional steps had to be developed for the photo elicitation process, which are normally not required for researcher-driven photo generation. So let's proceed to stage 1, image generation. So there are 2 aspects to image generation. First is participant briefing, and second, which I call image generation as conversation. So participant briefing is a fundamental activity undertaken at the beginning of the PhotoKwento process. Here, informed consent is obtained by stating the purpose, the focus, the method, and ethical considerations of the project in detail. So there is no standard format for the briefing. However, I would recommend covering at least 3 main issues. So first is the value of using photographs in research. Second, ethical and safety issues. You cannot just take photographs of anyone and anywhere, anytime. So these have to be very clear. The third is using the camera and the basic techniques in photography. So while PhotoKwento is participant-driven, its approach is semi-structured in the sense that participants are provided a set of general questions that guide their decisions regarding what kinds of images to capture. Another aspect of stage 1 is image generation as conversation. So I view the act of image generation in this context as already a space for conversation, for engaging in dialogue with research participants. Hence, as part of the research design, midweek and end-week check-ins were arranged where I would go to the communities and talk with the women participants individually regarding what they had done in the last few days. So the photos they had, what were the photos they had taken, and any concerns or thoughts that they had about the experience. I usually ask, what do you want to tell me with this photograph? Rather than simply saying, tell me about this photograph. So there's a difference. So this slight difference in framing the question allowed the participants to reflect on their reasons and motivations for taking the photographs instead of just describing what one could see in the images they have captured. This line of questioning tended to provoke detailed and emotion-laden responses grounded on concrete experiences. So this is an example of a photo that was taken. And so my participant said, these seem nice. I mean, we have concrete houses now. I am thankful that we are given a concrete house or balay nga bato. And then she pauses and looked at the photo again. But I am really not thankful. I am not happy here. I was happier with my old house where I used to live. I used to live close to my family and relatives, but now we are separated. I feel lonely here. So after this, she proceeded to talk some more about the significant changes she and her family had experienced as a result of resettlement, and how she as a mother and a wife felt the burden of domestic responsibilities in the context of disaster recovery. She showed me another photograph, this one, and it's a woman in a queue for fetching water while accompanied by a young child. And access to potable water is actually one of the main issues in resettlement. And then she said, I can really relate with this because no one else is able to help us with childcare. Mothers like myself bring our children with us wherever we go, in whatever we do. So with just these two pictures, she was able to tell me various layers of her recovery experiences, starting with we are thankful, but she expressed utang na loob, a cultural expression to be grateful, despite the fact that it did not seem to be what she wanted for herself or for her family. Moreover, the photo of concrete houses offered by government as a more resilient alternative to the houses and barong-barongs found in informal settlements. It was able to unlock emotional statements like, I am not happy here and I feel lonely here. And this became an opening for a more honest or open conversation about her life after resettlement. So here, on one hand, this conversation revealed intimate experiences of recovery at the scale of the body and emotions, home and community, interwoven with performances of care. But on the other hand, it also foregrounded and brought to question the broader institutional processes that had become the grounds for generating such experiences, rationalities for building back better and resilience building, resettlement processes and governing relations, and the cultural ascription of care work to women and its consequences in disaster recovery, among others. Hence, facilitating and engaging in meaningful conversation through photographs help expose the fissures in institutional processes of disaster recovery and thereby open these up to more critical analysis. So these would be recurring themes actually in the PhotoKwento interviews. Stage 2 is developing the PhotoKwento tool. So the development of the tool is where participants engage not only with me, but with each other. While the main objective here is the development of the tool, the process through which this is accomplished emphasizes the need to share stories, process commonalities and differences in perspectives and experiences, debate on issues which they think are important to their own recovery, and nurture a sense of awareness of each other's struggles as a form of solidarity despite the differences. This approach to processing participants' photo stories also served an important purpose for my study of ensuring that the photographs included in the interview tool would resonate and engage with other women's experiences of disaster and subsequent resettlement. So this is the tool development process. So first, they selected from their own photographs, and then they created individual storyboards. Then they posted the boards in an exhibit for each other to view and discuss, and they would ask questions. And then individually, they would share stories as shown in their storyboards. And then as a group, we had a workshop on identifying themes and categories, which would basically be the tool that I will be using for the interviews. And we build the album. They would choose the photographs that would fit the particular theme that they have identified. So that's basically my interview tool. It is a photo album. So stage 3 is PhotoKwento interviews. So the third and final stage involves individual interviews with women from selected study sites. Utilizing the PhotoKwento tool, I interviewed a total of 30 women who were not involved in the tool development process. As a supplement, you might want to have a set of guide questions to facilitate discussion. I prepared that for myself, but eventually I ended up not using not using the guide question because sometimes the conversation would just flow and not necessarily fit that structured logic of a guide question. So what were some of the lessons that I gleaned from this experience? So it was actually very confronting. It made me realize just how much the issue of power was central to research relationships. So initially, my approach to administering the interview had been to hold the photo album up and ask participants their thoughts about certain photographs. I quickly realized that this was not very effective. I could still feel the communication barrier between myself as a privileged Filipino woman and a so-called international researcher and my study participants. It was only when I started to give the participants the album, allowed them to touch it, flip through the pages, and hold it for the entire duration of the interview that they began to be more open. I saw this act as also symbolic of handing over control and letting participants take charge of the conversation. In the first few interviews as well, I found myself correcting what the participants were saying. So one particular interview jolted me to this realization. I was asking a study participant about the things or people that were enabling her recovery from the disaster. And then she pointed to a photo, this one, which depicted a group of women seated around the table smiling and said, "I think sometimes we need to relax, get together and have some drinks with our friends." And automatically I caught myself saying, "Oh, these women aren't drinking." And then she looked at it again and said, "Really? I thought they were having a good time because I think that's important. I think it's important too." But anyway, I corrected when she said that. And it was this response that really made me reflect how I was interpreting the photograph for her, and how once again I had tried to exercise my own power in the research process. And these were very important points for reflection, which, if unrecognized, would have undermined the purpose of PhotoKwento. As most interviews started with recounting traumatic experiences of the disaster, I was concerned with how this would affect the participants. Thus, certain measures must be put in place to be able to address these concerns, such as establishing a referral pathway, being prepared to provide a psychological first aid, and so on. But however, my research shows, participants were appreciative of the opportunity to talk about their experiences as a means of emotional release. While photographs evoke meanings, participants attach to places, objects, and people. For example, a photograph of the sea and sparked memories, what we used to do there, how the sea grew large and destroyed everything in sight during Yolanda. These also allowed them to confront not only feelings of loss, anxiety, insecurity, and fear, but also hope for the future. So while I'm unable to discuss at length the findings of my study, What came out of the PhotoKwento process was an incisive look into how Build Back Better was assimilated into the local context of Tacloban. So from women's intimate narratives of recovery, PhotoKwento revealed how attempts to rebuild and govern communities were heavily dependent on the participation and care-based practices of women, but have at the same time exacted costs on women's bodies, their energies, and their time. On the other hand, PhotoKwento also bared the ways in which women were qualifying, appropriating, or defying dominant constructs of resilience building and post-disaster development, which pervade much of current disaster risk management practices. So while housing and reconstruction and resettlement in post-Yolanda Tacloban was based on a rationale of safety and hazard avoidance as supported by expert and scientific knowledge, women were telling a different story of what they needed and aspired for in recovery. And this quote basically sums it up. So while safety is important, they have their own aspirations and they have their own ideas of what is important for their own recovery. So in conclusion, so from their diverse narratives, experience of Yolanda, I was able to gain insight into qualitatively different realms by using PhotoKwento. What comes distinctly and even uniquely with the use of photo-based methods is their ability to recenter the everyday embodied and emotional dimensions of daily life. They situate these dimensions in overlapping social spatial environments and capture these multi-layered textures in a single image or set of images. So PhotoKwento allows both researcher and study participants to rediscover facets of everyday experiences that often escape the gaze and attention of conventional disaster research. The intimate spaces of a house provided after a disaster, women's invisible care work, and the emotions attached to and generated by place. More importantly, PhotoKwento promotes collaborative knowledge construction, from image generation to the development of research tools, to the production of narratives. Study participants are centrally positioned in all these activities. Having participants take photographs independently takes them on a personal and embodied journey through the research process. They become physically present in a place, they hold the camera, they look through the lens, they angle their body, and they move with the light and the terrain. And they see things from their physical as well as social stature. This facilitates a sense of active involvement and ownership over what gets produced by the research. One participant commented, "I learned more things about my experience and the experiences of others," while another said, "We are researchers now." PhotoKwento, despite its potential for meaningful co-production of knowledge, is not impervious to power relations, as I have shown from my experience. As with any method, positionality must always come under continuous scrutiny as a practice of reflexivity as espoused by decolonial and feminist methodologies. According to Borland, no method or representational model can avoid the ethical dilemmas involved in politically committed research. A reflexive awareness of our multiple roles and identities as insiders and outsiders can help us more successfully produce scholarship that matters to communities. So working with local partners, understanding the social landscape, learning the local language, actively trying to share power, and operationalizing reflexivity in the actual conduct of research can help minimize power imbalances, which always already characterizes research relationships. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Kaira. Yeah, I really appreciated the kind of nuance this discussion that you had about the underpinnings of PhotoKwento and how it is different and how you found that conceptualization and the use of PhotoKwento in your own research. I think that care and the ethics that was there in your how you describe the process.
Yeah, and basically that became one of the central themes in my thesis, which I wasn't really thinking about when I started, and it's something that emerged after.
Thanks. We do have one question, and I think Pam is happy to ask that question.
Hi, Kaira. Thanks so much for your presentation. Of course, as someone also working in the disaster recovery sphere and also as an anthropologist, I really appreciated your presentation. It's making me reflect on my own use of photos in my own research. I have two questions, if that's okay. The
Yes.
first is on the terms of beneficence in the project, because the giving them a camera and expecting them to take photos for a week, that does take time and care on their end. So I was wondering whether the beneficence here was presented at the community level, or was it an individual level beneficence? And obviously, you mentioned earlier in your research that there was some form of catharsis and release through the use of the pictures, and I wonder whether this was expected, this was planned in terms of planning out the terms of beneficence of the project.
Yeah, so
My
basically,
second, sorry.
yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Kasi maybe you want to respond to that muna kasi mahaba-haba siya. And then ask me.
So, yeah, I engage with women individually. Actually, there was a stage 4 pa sa PhotoKwento, which I did not include anymore, wherein I engaged more with the community already with through a photo exhibit, community-based photo exhibit, which had the narratives as a way of giving back to them what the results of the research were. And I didn't want to just give them a summary report, which they won't have time to read anyway. So I used that community exhibit as a way to also give that back to the community. What was the other question? So ano ba yun? So first, individual engagement, and what was that second aspect, Pam? Sorry, it wasn't able.
The question is, what was the beneficence at the individual level, if any? But I think you already positioned it as a community level research, right? And so
on the individual, then it's something parang they also said that they were able to rediscover new things about their experience, which they haven't also talked about, and that emotional release as well was also quite common when I asked, because at the end of the interview I always ask, like, what did you think of the interview, what do you think of me, as part of the that reflexive practice of conducting interviews. Sorry, let me just plug in my laptop because it's yeah.
Okay,
Sige.
thanks.
Sige, Pam.
My second question is, maybe this is beyond the scope of the research, but this is a very powerful tool to really center the voices of women. And we're both practitioners, and I think one of my main frustrations in this space as a practitioner is when we talk about women's participation in disaster recovery. There are all these big women stakeholder meetings, where you all gather them in a barangay court. And there is some practicality to that, because it's also the women, quote unquote, who so-called have the time to attend, while the men are busy doing the quote unquote more important task of earning money.
Yeah.
Yes. But then when it comes to, so there's a space where their voices are heard, but then it's not really translated into decision making. So it's a very watered down notion of participation, and just for just playing around with the idea, how do you think this kind of technique can be integrated into disaster recovery projects that aim to center women's voices but are doing a poor job at it at the moment?
Actually, very interesting, because I have devoted an entire chapter actually talking about that particular issue that you raised, wherein there's all this talk about, okay, we're mainstreaming, we're promoting women's empowerment in disaster recovery by increasing the participation of women. But actually, what is happening is that the responsibility for community recovery is actually borne by women, especially in the resettlement areas, wherein many of the men who are fishers actually do not live in the resettlement site, but stay in the coast. And so it's the women who are actually in the village and who are being targeted for different interventions, of course. And this is couched in ideas of empowerment and participation. But it's actually basically a feminization of responsibility for community recovery. But I think what this brings out is that basically that unacknowledged idea that maybe the participatory interventions that we are making in disaster recovery is actually not beneficial to women, as it actually does eat away and erode the time that they have for well-being, for themselves, for rest. And one of the participants that I actually made a statement when I did the community exhibit was that she said, I hope that this is not something, that's just for our consumption. I hope that those in power actually get to see this, so that they will see the different struggles that we have at the resettlement area. And I think that's also another more practice oriented, perhaps action measure that can be taken. And we actually did have a plan to do a more public display and discussion, but COVID happened and I wasn't able to return anymore. So yeah, so certainly in terms of application of how we can use these the insights from PhotoKwento to help center discussion around these often marginalized issues in disaster recovery, which very much focuses on technocentric measures and very infrastructure related measures in reconstruction. But certainly that can be an ongoing discussion, Pam.
Yes. Here and on Messenger.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, Kaira, thanks for that very rich presentation. We can probably entertain more questions on Kaira's presentation later after the presentation of our second speaker. So yeah, from contemporary women's issues related to disaster recovery, we'll now take a look back at the 19th century women's issues in Manila, and our second speaker will help us unpack some of those issues. Dr. Marco Stefan Lagman is actually an assistant professor at the Department of Geography at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He recently completed his doctoral degree at the University of Murdoch University in Western Australia. His presentation is titled The Colonial State and the Regulation of Dangerous, Dirty, and Disturbing Women in 19th Century Manila. So Marco, over to you.
Okay, maraming salamat din. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. I must admit, people sometimes ask me, why on earth are you studying women in 19th century Manila? Sabi ko, parang ang layo sa pagkatao mo. Because I must admit, a while ago, Bonnie said that, the two speakers are feminists. I really don't know if I am one. Meaning in the sense that when I did this paper or this thesis, hindi ko masyadong alam kung ano gusto kong gawin talaga. Actually, what happened was I was presenting several papers on Manila, and then suddenly one person raised her hand and asked me, "You've been presenting several papers on Manila. Do you have a common theme that you could work on?" Sabi ko, wala akong topic. So what happened was I went back to the drawing board, and I must admit, I kept on presenting papers just so that I could get tenure, so that I could get published and get tenure. Then all of a sudden, I was working on the stuff that I did. Tapos nakita ko, I mean, common pala sa kanila. I hope okay lang na Tagalog ako, magsalita, no? And I noticed na basically, the common theme in all of my papers was the women of Manila during the 19th century. So nakakagulat na, nga, no, pwede pa silang pag-aralan, and the rest is history. So while Kaira dealt with people who are alive and well. I dealt with dead people. And basically, I'm here to tell their story. So basically, it's like necromancy for me. So yun ang pinakamalapit siguro. So basically, yun yung nasabi na yung title, and here's basically the introduction. So we're talking about 19th century Manila. And just to be clear, you'd be surprised that in terms of population distribution, ever since Manila was quite equal. In fact, most immigrants to Manila, and most of them were Tagalogs, most immigrants to Manila during the 19th century were female. And most foreign accounts of Manila, when they talk about the people, they would talk about how awesome the women were, in the sense that they had lives of their own, they handled their families, their status was quite high in society, etc., etc. But you know what? No one has really made a lot of studies about them, except for Guru for Kamagay and a few others, no? Labas doon, wala masyado. So that's the surprising part. Now, let's talk about the 19th century, sa Philippines. During that time, no, and I think we all know this, no, based on our college history courses, that the 19th century was a period of socioeconomic change. When the Philippines opened to the world market, Manila became very rich, etc., etc. The Ilustrado class came into being, and eventually challenged, no, became part of that challenge against Spain. No? Pero what people also tend to forget is that hindi lang socioeconomic yung change. There was also a population boom at that time. Just to give you an example, the population of Manila tripled from 1817 to 1892. Within a span of 70 plus years. That couldn't happen without a population boom and also a massive migration into Manila. And that was the start of Manila status, or Metro Manila status, as an in-migration area. No? So there was really demographic change at that time. Until now, historical demographers could not explain that population boom from 1800 to 1850. Hindi pa nila napapaliwanag yan hanggang ngayon. And probably matagal pa bago nila mapaliwanag at the rate we're going, no? But as also, what people do not realize is that Manila at that time experienced also massive spatial change. For all intents and purposes, Manila was the only urban area during the 19th century in the Philippines. And it expanded rapidly. So much that by 1860, the Spaniards decided to come up with a province of Manila, or Provincia de Manila, that actually approximates the Metro Manila that we have now. Ganun ka-impressive that they had an idea, okay, this should be the province of Manila. And pag tinanong mo ngayon, it's almost the same. Malapit na malapit sa kung anong meron po tayo ngayon. But also, another thing that people do not realize that this was also the era of the modern colonial state, no? Spain was starting to lose all of its colonies, and they were concentrating on 3 colonies na lang, and one of them was the Philippines. And they brought in so many bureaucrats and so many military men that they were able to come up with what we call a colonial state, no? And that tried to impose order and regulate people's lives, no? Through the police and the judicial state, yung mga police apparatus nila and laws. This is new because before that, it was basically the church that was handling order or keeping order in Philippine society. Then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose in the 1800s. There was so much change that they couldn't handle it. Now the state had to, come in. Now, rapidly urbanizing Manila became that site where the state tried to impose order and protect elite interests through law and enforcement. So basically, they came up with policies and they established institutions. What's important here is that rules and regulations that they came up with actually reflected what was dangerous, dirty, and disturbing in their eyes and in the eyes of the elite. In particular, they concentrated on women, who they thought were threats to upper-class residences, to labor productivity, public health, and morals. So ito na po yung dangerous, dirty, and disturbing. And they zeroed in, my study zeroes in on 4 of them. 5 actually, I'm sorry. One would be the criada, or the servant, the house servant. Number 2, the wet nurse or the nodriza, which actually I found by accident sa prostitute documents. Nakagulat, no? Parang when you go to the archives, magugulat ka kung ano makikita mo eh. Minsan, misplaced pa yung documents. The pangginge or the gambling operator, the prostitute or the mujer de publica, and last but not the least, the scandalous woman. Yung dasing na babae na nagwawala sa daan. So, regulation, monitoring, and if need be, punishment of such women also reveals what? The government's need for funds, underscores the patriarchal nature of colonial society, and also, and this is very important, we experience things differently. And that's the same with colonialism. Some benefited from it, some were enabled by it, and some suffered because of it. So my questions center on 4 things, no? Na nasabi na natin. Who were these women that the state considered dangerous, dirty, and disturbing? And next, what were the policies and programs that were enacted and implemented to regulate these women? From their entry into the workplace, to their activities, and also how to limit their movements. Because I'm from the geography department, and I must admit I'm really more of a historian than a geographer, I had to use something that was quite geographical. So I had to visually represent the effects of these regulations in space by using GIS, which I learned and I have already forgotten, I must admit. No? Now, last but not the least, what do these regulations reveal about the state and prevailing social norms? So let us start with the servidumbre domestica or the servant, the house servant. No? Para lang makita nyo that they were actually well-known and recognized as part of the landscape and social landscape at that time. These are illustrations from a satirical newspaper called Manila. The first one is quite obvious. It's an old man sexually harassing the maid while the wife actually is watching. The second one is interesting. The kasambahay has visited a laundry service and the man was quite surprised. Like, I saw you last week. Why are you back? Kasi sabi ng babae, it's because may senoritas ran out of clothes kasi lagi siyang nasa bailihan. Kasi yun naman ang uso noon. The bailihan was a site where the females could meet men and actually get married, eventually find their partner at that time. No? So, let's talk about the criadas. No? By 1873, 1 out of 67 Manila residents were actually servants. Ganun kadami, no? And servants, no, became some kind of status symbol for rich European families. Marami po sa kanila, may mga servants sila. And if you could look at the lists, ang dami. Napakadami ng iba, sometimes up to 6 or 7. They were actually used as some kind of status marker. But also, they were also a necessary evil. Why? They made things easier for a lot of people. Alam naman natin yun, di ba? Like ngayon, sabi palag ng mga tao, mahirap ang hanap na maayos na kasambahay ngayon. Man, totoo po yan. Pero totoo yan noon, totoo rin yan noon. No? They made life really convenient, but there could also be untrustworthy. So, hindi ko naman nila lahat. No? But here's the thing. At that time, the Philippines had no mature banking sector. So most people kept their assets in terms of what? As jewelry, as furniture, basically portable wealth. So they kept these at home. And just imagine a person from the province who is so poor and then expose siya to such abundance. It could be a formula for disaster, di ba? And in some cases, it actually happened. So the elite were actually very concerned and the state was so concerned to the point wherein 1848 pa lang, only 12 years after the Philippines was open to world commerce, they already came up with this policy on how to police and how to manage their domestic servants. And mind you, they prioritize the elite, yung mga people who are either Spanish or of European descent. Yung mga Chinese mestizos, Chinese and Indios who had kasambahay, sinunod na lang eventually. Pero inuna muna yung elite to protect elite interests. So now, they came up with registration. Every servant has to register sa isang office. So they actually created the Office of Public Safety just for the regulation and monitoring and disciplining of servants. This was even before the Guardia Civil was created noong 1870s. And the Guardia Civil eventually took over this role. No? Sila na ang bahala dyan. Sila na ang namahala sa usapin na ito noon. But first, they were monitored by the OPS. Now, the OPS came up with a procedure wherein a kasambahay would have to register sa office nila 24 hours after arriving sa place of work niya, accompanied by her boss. Now, after getting all of her permits in order, and she has to show that she came from a barangay na may clearance siya, may clearance na po noon from her barangay of origin. Pagkatapos po noon, she would be given a notebook. The notebook will be given to her boss. The boss will keep the notebook, and once she quits her job, she will have to return the notebook personally dun sa office. This is done so that they could not easily transfer from one boss to another. Kasi kahit nung panahon, uso na ang panunulot. Nanunulot na sila ng kasambahay nung pa lang. So yun, iniiwasan din nila. So sa registration nakalagay your name, your age, the name of your parents, your race, place of birth, their employer, and current residence. Then they had monitoring procedures. They would visit from time to time dun sa bahay just to check, kamusta na po yung kasambahay ninyo, nandiyan ba siya? And then they also punished runaway servants. Runaway servants, those who absconded would get an 8-day jail sentence, and they could be freed before that period if they could pay a 4 peso fine. Now, just to show you how expensive a 4 peso fine is, in 1998, ang 4 pesos noong 1890s is equivalent to 8,000 pesos noong 1998. So if you use inflation, mga 16,000 pesos sa present day. Ganun kamahal. 3% ang annual inflation, let us say, from 1998 hanggang ngayon, 2020. Now, they also came up with bureaucratic mechanisms to capture a kriada. If a kriada absconds, the boss or the employer reports it to the police. The police will fine the boss 5 pesos, and then they will set up a system to catch the kriada. At umaabot po yan hanggang Ilocos Norte. Ganun kakomplikado yung proseso. At ganun din sila kasigasig sa paghuhuli kung sakali. And may mga nahuhuli ulit. So, para lang makita gano'ng kaimportante ang mga kasambayan noon, hindi lang sila isang necessary evil, they're also a source of revenue. Paano? How so? Those who work as kasambahay in Manila at that time were exempt from forced labor. All they had to do was pay an extra, how many pesetas? A peseta is 20 centavos. Okay, so here's an example. Romana Almedilla was a registered domestic servant, 15th of May, 1879. She was relatively old, 37 years old, and the daughter of, parents who were still alive. She was a resident of Quiapo, and she belongs to the Association of Indios or Naturales. Her residence was verified were the two most powerful people in her community, the gobernadorcillo and the parish priest, and both of them are obviously male. Note, she registered 24 hours after starting work in her employer's household. Here's another, just to show you how legible they are in the eyes of the state. There was a woman, Bonifacio de los Santos, na nakalagay pa kung anong physical features niya. Stature, short, hair, medium brown, eyes black, nose flat, beard, well, obviously no beard, face, regular, skin color, brown, and this is impressive, with a birthmark on the left arm. Ganun sila sigasig sa pag-collect ng data just to make sure that they monitor people properly. Now, cases of servants who absconded, there were plenty, but I'll give you a few. Don Jacinto Calvo of Calle Nueva in Ermita returned the notebook of his criada Maria Libulo. She went missing with 10 pesos worth of silver, 16,000 pesos in our current day prices. 30,000 today. I'm sorry, 30,000 in today's prices ang 10 pesos of silver. And then here's another one. Gertrude Sanz, tinakasan niya si Doña Eugenia na taga Sampaloc without warning before Valentine's Day noong February 1892. She disappeared with 2 rings, precious stones valued at 75 pesos. My God. Ang mahal-mahal po nun. Hindi na po yan nakuha. Pero ito po yung the best. Si Petra Lagat ay kasambahay ni Alejandro Blanchard, a French guy, and a Spanish Filipina, si Pilar Franco, who was a Spaniard born in the Philippines. Insular siya. Nanakawan daw siya ng clothes and grocery. Nag-date sila. Nung gabi, pag uwi nila, wala na si Alejandro, wala na si Petra. So, pinuntahan nila yung Guardia Civil. Yung Guardia Civil came up with a search team immediately and interviewed 2 silversmiths. Bakit? Because baka pinatunaw na yung gold grocery. Kasi Manila is so big that you could disappear and a piece of jewelry could disappear and pwede siyang patunawin at gawin ng ibang bagay. No? I-form mo siya into another thing. Now, she was also charged in absentia 72 hours after she failed to respond. No, and she was given 72 hours to respond. Now, ang impressive dito is, nangyari yung crime September 27. By October 21, umabot na po ng Rizal at Bulacan yung mga orders. Well, medyo mabagal for our standards, no? But isipin mo at that time, no? Mabilis-bilis na rin naman yun. Maliban doon, na-confirm by October 22, last na naman, ng parish priest ng Dingras, kung saan galing supposedly ito si Petra, na si Petra nga ay taga sa kanila, na-baptized, but she is Petra Abanilla. So, ibig sabihin, talagang maabilidad si Petra. Finake niya pati yung kanyang papers nung pumasok siya kila Mr. and Mrs. Blanchard. So, kahit noon, may mga nanggugulang na talaga, both sides, mayaman man o mahirap, no? Now, let us map yung incidents ng theft cases. This is a very interesting map, no? Why? Dito po napapatunayan na karamihan po ng mga mayayaman ay taga-intramuros at karamihan ng mga stressful amo-kasambahay relations occurred here. Now, the second place goes to Binondo. Why Binondo? Because simply put, Binondo was the richest district of all, no? Third place is Santa Cruz at maraming mga Chinese mestizo families dito. Now, how about Sampaloc, Quiapo, and Ermita? This is called basically the suburbs of Manila at that time. Okay? So ito yung reason kung bakit marami na rin po nandyan. Okay. Oops, sorry, mga dogs po nagwawala. Okay, so lipat na po tayo sa wet nurses. Sorry wait lang po . Okay, so let's talk about wet nurses. The documents on wet nurses nahanap ko sa prostitution documents. And there's reason for that, no? All wet nurses and all prostitutes were regulated and monitored by the hygiene section of Manila. And nalaman ko lang, kaya napasama siya sa prostitution documents. Now, this is a illustration again in Manila. It's a woman who just gave birth and her husband. Ang sinasabi ni babae kay lalaki, pwede mo nang paalisin yung nodrisa natin or wet nurse. Hindi ko naman kailangan ng wet nurse kasi ako naman ay may gatas. Tapos nagalit yung lalaki, sabi niya, in Spanish of course, no? Na, nako, paalisin ko na siya, kailangan ko na naman matutong uminom ng gatas ng baka. So what happened? Well, you know the joke, no? Ito na yung joke and it's a bad joke, no? But ganun ka-sexist yung mga newspapers noong panahon. Now, talking about yung mga policies ng nodrisas, kailangan natin maintindihan na noong panahon na yon, wet nursing was really a common practice in Europe and in North America. In fact, whether it was caused by vanity, poor health, or necessity to earn a living, in France, wet nursing was actually a regulated industry and was big business. The case is the same for England and to a certain extent the United States, no? So wet nursing was really something that was an occupation. In fact, in the civil registers of Manila at that time, marami kami nakikitang nodrisa. Yun ang trabaho niya, wet nurse. Now, again, the same problem arises, no? Seems like a straightforward transaction. A household employs a wet nurse for the children, and they pay the girl for the service, but it's not that easy. Why? Usually, taga-probinsya, again, different backgrounds, different values, and worst of all, can be they can also be disease carrying yung babae. So dito natakot yung authorities, and they had trust issues, no? Similar to domestic servants and nodrizas. So ang proposed solution was by 1897, let us set up a wet nurse section under the Bureau of Public Hygiene together with the public women or sex workers, no? Prostitutes. Now, it was in 1897, mind you, this was actually during the Philippine Revolution, but still, they came up with such a policy for the moral and sanitary surveillance of wet nurses. So it involved medical inspection, sakit ba, healthy ba yung babae, registration, monitoring, also over movements. No? So similar to the maid or servant. Now, what is surprising here and what is very patriarchal is that if you want to become a wet nurse, you needed to get the approval of your husband or your male relative. No, usually your uncle nung time na yon, para lang matuloy yung pagtrabaho mo. Now, 1897 nag-umpisa ito. Pero siguro isang reason ba't ginawa din nila ito is because even before that, may mga cases na ng pagnanakaw. Because there were working women at that time. There were two of them. One of them is Miss Molina, who is actually a stall owner in a theater. What happened was, Ambrosia Alberto was her wet nurse. She grew to trust her to the point wherein she allowed Ambrosia's husband to stay with them sa bahay. And then she told Ambrosia na, I have to go to the theater ngayong New Year's Eve because may show. So, meron siyang kainan doon. When she came back, ayun na. She lost 3 gold rings with precious stones, a gold pin and 9 gemstones, a golden Crayola, 2 pins with a pearl each. So this woman was loaded, no? Ang dami yung pera. Pero, ang sad part dito ay yung trust niya was not repaid, no? And this was also the same with another woman who worked in a factory as a maestra or quality assurance person. Parang yung mga QA sa call center, parang ganon. The same case happened. Ninakawan din siya, and in both cases there were male accomplices, no? Pero siguro this was the reason why they came up with such policies, no? Kasi natatakot sila na pwede nga silang nakawan, lalo na yung mga members ng elite, no? Now, next we talk about panggingge. Now, gambling is something that Filipinos are known for. In fact, sabi nga ng maraming mga foreign visitors sa Philippines noong 1800s that the Philippines was basically gambling central, no? Para isang scourge daw ng Philippine society ang gambling. And men and women gambled. Pero here's the thing. Despite the fact that Filipinos gambled a lot, hindi naman talaga yan ang problema. The Spanish just really wanted to ensure that they could regulate gambling and make money out of it. That explains why there's cockfighting. Why? Because cockfighting occurs in a galeria or yung tinatawag ngayon na Coliseum or sa probinsya, sports complex. So it's a fixed area. So geographically, you can control it. It's the same with panggingge. It's a card game that requires a table and several Spanish cards that you buy from the state. And then, yun nga, you can set up shop. The funny thing here is that it was only panggingge among so many games na pinayagan nila. And this is something that's difficult to understand. Hindi ko alam po kung bakit ganon. Pero tingnan niyo po the Overseas Ministry of Spain, yung Ministerio de Ultramar, gumawa sila ng 1863 regulations as early as that time. Na you can only gamble from 12 noon to 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. 12 noon to 2 p.m. is siesta time. You are not working at that time. 6 to 10 p.m., well, tapos na yung work. Someone might ask, why 10 p.m.? Ba't pinaalis na sila? Ba't hanggang 10 p.m. lang? Because you have to work the next day. So this shows that by the 1800s, Manila was actually quite capitalist. No, people were paid to do jobs. They had to be productive. If not, lagot ka. And women at that time were actually very keen business people. No. 30% of all listed gambling tables were women operated, yung kapanggingge, and 47% of all panggingge tax payments by 1896, again, during the Philippine Revolution, were paid by women. This is very important because it shows that when we talk about Philippine history, ang akala mo Philippine Revolution, nagkagulo ang lahat. Yung katotohanan, nagkagulo yung ilan. karamihan sitting pretty lang. Wala silang pake dyan. Sad to say, wala silang pake. Manila was quite insulated from the revolution. Wala talaga. By 1897, they were still accepting business permits. No? So, sino ang nagbibigay ng lisensya? It is the provincial governor of Manila, but the Guardia Civil recommends issuance or non-issuance. Now, what is the basis of issuance or non-issuance? Well, number one, pag may babae nag-apply or lalaki, it doesn't really matter, sabihin ng Guardia Civil, papayagan namin kasi kaya namin ma-monitor. Pag hindi nila kaya ma-monitor, usually ang dahilan nila ay masyadong malayo sa kampo, number one. Number two, ang dami na masyado na negosyo dyan. So, may carrying capacity standards pa pala sila noon. Bawal, masyado na maraming negosyo, hindi ka kikita. And last but not the least, yung lokasyon ng panggingge table mo, hindi namin makikita mula sa labas ng daan, mula sa daan, papunta sa bahay mo. So, dapat nakikita ka. So, dapat nandun ka sa garahe o halos sa labas lang ng bahay. Now, this is an interesting part. Gambling raids required no warrants. Hindi mo kailangan ng warrant of arrest dyan. Pwede ang state na manghuli lang. Ang justification state dyan is ayaw nilang mawala yung element of surprise. Pero ang hindi nila nakikita rito ay pinagkakitaan ng Estado ang mga manunugal. Kasi pag nakahuli ka noon, 1/4 of the confiscated money and the fines go to the police station. 1/4 goes to the one who made sumbong, yung nanumbong, yung denunsyador. Siyempre, may mga magsusumbong. Ito, may nagsusugal po dyan. So may denunsyador. And number 3, 50%, so 25%. 50% goes to the state. It goes to the treasury, the tesoro. No? Now, incarceration, pag nahuli ba nila, pinapreso nila? Ay, hindi. Bakit nila huliin ang mga manunugal? Kumikita ng pera yan. Sayang naman. So, ang gagawin nila let's just assess fines. But there's also logic to it. No? They consider gambling a minor offense, something that people will keep on doing over and over again. Isipin niyo po, pag preso ka ng preso ng maraming manunugal, mapupuno yung preso, pakakainin mo yan. O, babantayan mo yan. Di ba nakakapagod po yan? Huwag na natin ipreso. Pagkakitaan na lang natin. So, pera-pera lang yan. So, it just shows that the state at that time was really that desperate. And it so happened that a lot of those who were arrested, many of those gambling operators who were arrested for either not having a license or operating during prohibited hours were actually females. An example of that is, number 1, Modesta Ramirez, along Calle Magdalena sa San Jose, Manila. Nahuli siya, wala siyang lisensya, nagpapalaro siya. 5 babae ang kasama. Ito yung nakakalungkot dito. Wala namang pera silang nakuha. So what does that mean? What the state sees as a minor offense is actually a pastime for some. For these women, this was actually a pastime. Think about it. Anong oras sila nahuli? 3 p.m. Panoon dyan ng hapon, tapos na yung gawaing bahay na maraming mga tao. So these women were just having fun. They weren't after the money. Kasi noon, if it's high stakes gambling, it's not panggingge, it's monte. That's another game, no? Now, in 1886, ganun din, same case. A seamstress named Cristina Bayani was arrested, no, for holding an illegal card game. Now, this is not panggingge, this is most likely monte. But this shows who were the suspects. Sino yung mga nahuling nagagamble? These are ordinary people. Day laborers, washermen. Yes, washermen. It was not a gendered occupation at that time, labandero. And then for women. And then a washerwoman named Maria Asuncion. And last but not the least, ganito talaga pag gusto mong magsugal. 4 women decided, wag na tayo magsugal sa bahay. Magsugal tayo sa gubat. So they went to San Mateo's Wilderness. Pati doon, nahuli pa rin sila ng Guardia Civil. San Mateo na po yan. Ang San Mateo po noon ay kilala bilang pinagkukuhanan ng troso ng Maynila. So, gubat po yan. Sino mo yun, tsagain ng pulis, huli ng mga tao sa gubat. Talagang big money siya. Now, 10 ang location ng mga arrests. Most arrests occurred in Manila. Pero notable is Pasay, Malabon, and Navotas. There's a reason behind this. Malabon and Navotas was actually a place where there was a high population of immigrant Chinese, no? Immigrant Chinese, and there are a lot of rich people. Same with Pasay, which was actually basically like the suburbs of Manila after Ermita and Malate. So marami pong mga mayamang tao po dito. Or mayabong po at mayaman ng ekonomiya nila. Gaano kayaman ang ekonomiya ng Malabon? Well, the first long-range Tranvia line was Manila to Malabon. That was even before the time of the Americans. Ganun po ka-importante ang Malabon noon that they were keen on establishing a tram line there so that goods could be transported even during flood periods. Okay, now let's talk about public women. Now, again, lumalabas siya even in print media. The first picture seems hazy, but it's actually a picture of two men ogling a pair of legs. Yes, pair of legs. The other one is, I think, one of the first comic strips na nakita ko sa Pilipinas. Okay, it's a picture of a woman and a man na nakatingin sa kanya. The woman looks at the man na nasa likod. The man follows the woman. Man gives chase. Woman enters an establishment that has Chinese characters on it. A telltale sign that it's a brothel because the Chinese were known for managing a lot of brothels. And lo and behold, hindi pala siya brothel, pansiteria pala siya. Okay? So, this is an example of how common prostitution was at that time. No? Now, in rapidly urbanizing colonial societies, actually even in urban areas right now, prostitutes were the personification of disorder, disease, immorality, and filth. No? And they were also usually the object of strict state management control and violence. Pinaparusahan talaga sila. Now, Manila in the 1800s had all the ingredients for prostitution to flourish. There were at least 10,000 Chinese men who were not married because there were rarely any Chinese women who joined them. Only 3% of Chinese immigrants at that time were female. No? And there were also a lot of military personnel, and there were a lot of foreign investors at that time. So ang dami mga males, single males in Manila. And then add the fact that a lot of people had disposable income in Manila at that time, and it sets up a condition for prostitution to actually flourish. Now, the initial approach of the Spanish authorities from the 1860s to the 1880s was this: we will arrest you in the streets, we will arrest you in brothels, we will arrest you in apartments. Yes, there were people who provided services in their own homes. We will arrest you in iron workshops that actually serve as a brothel at night, soap stores that has a hidden door, and then we will punish you. And they punished them big time. Some of them were subjected to corporal punishment. Some of them were subjected to short-term imprisonment. And this is the worst, no? Some of them had to suffer the shame of being repatriated to their own hometowns, or worse, even first-time offenders were deported to faraway agricultural colonies in Palawan, Jolo, and Davao. This is so that they could people these colonies na hindi pa masyadong marami ang mga tao. Now, was prostitution ever legalized in the Philippines? Sabi na marami, wala daw, hindi daw na-legalized. No, that's not true. It was legalized temporarily. No, they were formally legalized in 1897, but I found a document that they were actually already legal as early as 1890. They had what they call casas de toleradas, or tolerated houses. No, so this is basically de facto legalization, and the Spanish authorities decided, let's follow the British. No, let's just legalize prostitution because there's so many of them, hindi na natin kayang i-handle. Huwag na natin parusahan masyado, hindi na uso ang pagparusa. No? Ang gawin na lang natin, let's just find them and regulate them. Let's assess fines for medical exams. Let's assess them fines for getting a license to become a sex worker, etc., etc. So, pero ito po yung masamang bahagi dito. Ang logic dito ay, they thought that they could contain prostitution in certain spaces, no? So that they could help contain the spread of disease and immoral behavior. Obviously, hindi naman mangyayari yon. My hunch is that they wanted to regulate prostitution because they were afraid that their Spanish military would become so diseased, no, that by the time they go into war, and at that time they had campaigns in Mindanao, baka may sakit ang mga to. Ayaw nila yon. People might find this funny, no? But actually, the Americans and the British were very concerned about prostitution because they wanted to protect their military personnel. Kaya nga sa Pilipinas, no, when the Americans arrived, nagkalat talaga ang syphilis at gonorrhea because of these American soldiers, no? And they tried to regulate it as well, no, but they met a stiff challenge from the Catholic Church. Kaya hindi nila nilegalize ang prostitution eventually. But ito pa yung mas patriarchal, ay mas masama doon. If a man is doing something indecent, keep it private. And worst of all, parang ang lumalabas, ang may kasalanan kung bakit may sakit ang mga tao at kumakalat ang sakit ang STD sa Maynila ay dahil sa mga babae lamang. Never na never sinisisi na ang mga lalaki equally carriers din sila of the disease. No? So, the policies were actually very crude, no? Again, towards women. For example, for a woman to get a prostitute's license, she had to get the consent of her elders. Sino ba namang pamilya magsasabi na, hindi, pinapayagan ko maging sex worker ng anak ko. Sobrang nakaka-insulto yun. Hindi lang po yun. Kung ang isang sex worker ay aalis sa kanyang trabaho at lilipat ng bayan, bawa, ayaw ka na maging sex worker, lipat na ako ng ibang bayan, i-announce po yan sa dyaryo na this sex worker is transferring residence. Grabe, they were really stigmatized, no? No. So here are examples of these dirty and dangerous women. Consana Nunez was a stay-at-home seamstress and washerwoman of Doña Rita del Prado ng Tondo. Ang di alam ni Doña Rita, Ponciano was actually moonlighting as a sex worker in the brothel of a woman named Fabiana in 1871. When she was caught, she was severely punished. She was whipped repeatedly, called a vagabond or non-tribute payer, meaning wala siyang sedula, by Tondo's elite, and then was banished to an agriculture colony. No question, walang appeal yun. Straight yun. In 1882, two brothers, the brothers C, were owners of a soap shop sa Santa Cruz. Na actually, brothel talaga. So, frontal lang nila yung soap shop. Talagang brothel siya. Ang ginawa, yung mga members ng community nag-complain na yung reputasyon ng komunidad namin at ang aming mga kabataan nasisira dahil sa soap shop na yan, maduming soap shop na yan. So, the police raided. And one of them, Paula Prim, a native of Malabon, was arrested. So, talagang nanghuli sila. And this is the worst. How desperate are you to become a prostitute or to make money? Valentina Domingo was a resident of San Miguel, Manila, but she did sex work in the most unusual places. No, she was caught on August 19, 1891 in a storage area for smoked fish. Ang baho ho dyan, tinapareria with a Chinese man. Pero hindi siya dineport kasi 1891 na. Ang ginawa nila ng state, magbayad ka ng 5 piso, palayain ka na namin. Which she did. She paid 5 pesos and she was freed. Now, here is one of the first maps that shows the distribution of brothels at that time. Kung titingnan niyo po mabuti, even in the heart of religion, Intramuros, ang dami po mga brothels po dyan. Also with Binondo, dahil pera dyan eh. And also Santa Cruz, and also yung parts ng suburbs. Mind you, prostitution follows main roads or main transport systems. When the Americans arrived, prostitution spread outside of Manila through the tram system. Where the tram went, so did the prostitutes and the dance halls. Yun po ang nangyari. Hanggang ngayon, halimbawa, ako yung taga LA, Lower Antipolo. Bago papunta na po ako ng Marcos Highway, makikita ninyo, walang prostitute areas, walang red light district ang Marikina. Pero may mga girly bars ang Marcos Highway. Labas na ng Marikina. Lagi yan. Ang Naga City, walang red light district doon. Pero yung katabi nilang bayan, Milaor, tinanggap lahat ng mga pinaalis ng Naga. So para lang yung makita na it's really hard to contain prostitution. Hindi mo talaga makakontain yan. Now, the last group of women whom the authorities didn't like were the drunkards. And usually they were also prostitutes, no? The Spanish Penal Code, no, Article 58, ang public disorder face stiff penalties, no? Those who were guilty of it. You're either fined anywhere between 7 pesos to 75 pesos, and you spent a month in jail. Now, women who were drunk or causing fights in public were not only a nuisance, but they were literally out of place and violated patriarchal mores. No? But the truth is, women, for the authorities, women who were in public were out of place. Diba? Ang mga may mga matitinong babae ay wala dapat sa public. Yan ang pananaw nila. Yan ang prevailing na pananaw. And even in school curricula, pag kinumpare mo ang curriculum ng Ateneo noon at ng Santa Isabel, yung dalawang top schools noon, Santa Isabel ay para sa mga babae, makikita mo yung difference na yung skills na binibigay sa lalaki para maging bahagi ka ng public life. Yung skill set na tinuturo sa babae para maging bahagi ng bahay. Which is really sad, no? Tapos, ang isa pa dyan, pwede kayong mag-drink, pwede kayong mag-away, bahala kayo dyan, babae man o lalaki, but do it in private. But on a serious note, the street was also a place that reflected the state's ability or inability to impose order. So kailangan talaga nila na ma-handle yung lugar. Na wala dapat na magulo o nanggugulo sa ating mga daan at lansangan. But in reality, did they assess long jail terms and fines? Hell no. They only assess you 2 pesos. Kung lasing ka, may 2 pesos ka ba? O sige, wag ka na. Get out of jail free ka na dyan. Kung hindi, you stay 4 days in jail. Ganun lang. Ulit, pera-pera lang sa mata ng Estado. Again, ito ay mga picture na mga babaeng umiinom. Mind you, manzanilla at crema de cacao. Yan ang mga inumin ng mga babae noon. Pero yung mga inumin na yan ay ginagawa sa loob lang ng bahay. No? Or sa tindahan. Kasi may isa akong nakitang case, yung kumadrona after siyang magpanganak, pumunta ng tindahan, sari-sari store, bumili ng tuba. Tapos, pagkainom niyang tuba, bumili na siya. Pero anyway, itong last picture na to ay dalawang babae, dalawang kasambahay na nag-aaway. Winawalis yung isa. Yung kung titingnan nyo, na ang nasa background po ay lalaking may stick at may bag. Siya po yung cook. Yung cook kasi finire. Kasi nga, pinag-aawayan siya ng dalawang babae. Haba ng buhok ni Kuya. But anyway, these are examples, again, from archival documents. Si Valentina Sebastian at si Maria de los Reyes ay parehas senglot at hinuli in separate incidents in Manila ng 1889. Malas nila, they spent 4 days in jail kasi pare wala silang pera. Yung previous year, si Simeona Indan, maswerte. May enough points siya to escape jail. Tapos, marami silang lakot in groups. And usually, outnumbered ang lalaki sa babae. Kaya nga, ang teorya, malamang sila ay mga streetwalkers or sex workers who are trying to get customers sa streets, no? Example would be Josefa Vidal, Miguel Morales, Vigas Versosa. Others would be Domingo Villanueva, supposedly the Bugaw, and Hilaria Amaya and Ana Garcia. Now, bilang pagtatapos, no, the geographies of dangerous women, no, criadas compromise the safety of employers' possessions, wet nurses threaten nursing children's health, pangigi operators could affect workers' productivity, and mujeres de publica or public women endangered their physical and moral health, no, ng communities. And women were either drunk or fighting, and that caused scandal went against both legal and patriarchal prescriptions. The colonial state went about implementing policies to assess such individuals, monitor their activities, restrict their movements, and if needed, discipline them. The studies also prove that GIS can be used as a tool in helping us imagine or visualize our stories. And policies, in particular, women also reflected the financial distress that the state was in, as well as the patriarchal values of the ruling. Hindi lamang po, maraming salamat.
Marco, maraming salamat sa very historic rich presentation. Guys, if you have questions, you can now turn on your camera and then you could either raise your hand or type in your questions in our chat box. A lot of regulatory interventions during the time of the revolution. Eh?
Actually, yun nga, parang sinisira yung notion na ang gulo ng revolusyon. Baka magulo sa isolated areas, pero hindi sa lahat.
Yeah.
Hindi talaga.
Siguro yung isang magsimula na akong magtanong, Marco, about
Sure.
parang, so you have the colonial state and this supposedly disturbing women, but briefly you mentioned the role of the church. Sa kalakhan, ano yung position nila mga ganitong policies, or at that time, waning na yung role ng church as an institution?
Actually, hindi. They were still very strong, no? Kasi I'll give an example. Labas dun sa question, divorce was actually allowed sa Spanish law. And they brought the law here in 1887.
Yeah.
But the authorities, the civil authorities, were afraid to be on the bad side of the church. So hindi nila in-implement. Sabi nga ng isang in-interview ng mga Amerikano na lawyer na Pilipino, the governments here are quite monkish. So takot sila sa simbahan. Oo. Pero doon sa pag-regulate ng mga babae, hindi ko alam. Wala pa ako nakikitang, well, di ba sa history, no document, no history or no analysis.
Kasi for instance, you mentioned the tolerated houses or brothels. Wala bang public document like the church issuing a public statement opposing that kind of legal tolerance? Archival document.
Wala po nung panahon ng Kastila, pero nung panahon ng Amerikano meron na. Nung panahon ng Amerikano kasi, ang ginawa ng mga Kano para malusot nila yung prostitution, kasi naging illegal na by the 1910s, no? Ang ginawa nila, yung dance halls ang ginamit nila. Men could pay women to dance with them. Then after they go to the table, they could arrange something. Parang let's have an arrangement. A lot of people protested, particularly the church. Yung church ay umaangal noong time na yun. Very active sila. I don't know why, no? Pero baka I just benefited from the fact that there's a lot more information ng Amerikano. Kumpara nung ng Kastila. Siguro if there's a chance, baka pwedeng tingnan ng church archives, no? They might have been talking about it, no? Ang problema lang sa Pilipinas right now, yung mga in church archives, banned ng mga researchers diyan. Kasi hindi ko na papangalanan, may isang kilalang history expert sa Pilipinas na foreigner. Ginago niya yung simbahan. Parang may usapan na hindi mo ilalabas itong mga documents na to or yung mga statements na to, nilabas niya sa isang study. So after that, hindi na pinapayagan. Ethical
issues in research,
data
gathering. Yeah.
By the way, wala akong masyadong hindi ako dinaan sa ethics board kasi puro patay na raw yung mga pag-aaralan ko.
Yeah.
So wala na. Deads na daw sila lahat. So hindi ako pinahirapan.
Yeah, kasi yun nga, maganda rin sana i-compare yung regulation by the colonial state and by the supposedly spiritual, the more influential spiritual institution.
Yeah, I think by the American period, yung divorce issue yung nakialam talaga ang simbahan. And by the way, there was actually divorce. May divorce noon nung from 1918 to 1947 there was divorce, pero ang pwede lang na grounds for divorce ay adultery, meaning yung babae nangaliwa.
There's still double standard.
Grabe, no? Patriarchal.
Yeah. Bon, you had a question, and probably Nina, did you raise your hand? Okay, yeah. So we'll probably go to Nina first and then Bon.
Marco, thanks for that. It's very interesting. So I'm a lawyer back in the Philippines, so this was very interesting to me. My question lang is, when you look at these regulations, right, and then you contextualize it, so you draw conclusions na, for example, it's about It's about it's less about it's more of like when you mentioned that prostitution was prohibited because of the soldiers, like they wanted to protect the health of the soldiers. I'm just curious about that process of contextualizing the law. Like what do you think about, how do you draw greater conclusions or generalizations from your
Yeah.
study of those regulations?
Yeah. I think yung gusto ko lang linawin yung kanina sinabi ko, it's a possibility. Yun yung isang posibleng pwedeng dahilan, no? For example, I actually saw a document wherein the authorities were actually very concerned. So this is a formal document. They were concerned that prostitution is spreading not just in Manila but in Cavite, which basically is yung military encampments ng Castilla. So because of such a concern, naglabas pa yung parang military governor of Cavite na, we assure you na none of my men has syphilis. Nakakatawa nga eh. Parang wala pong may sakit dito. Lahat po sila able and ready for war just in case. Parang ganyan. Basta nakakatawa. But that's one, no? Ang isa pa ay, when you look at the literature sa ibang mga colonies, no, you will see na ang major concern palagi ng authorities was to ensure that their military was always healthy. Yung talagang lagi nilang yung laging nila doon, na mapanaliti nating healthy talaga siya, no, na hindi sila magkasakit. The British were experts in this, no. Sila talaga yung pinagmulan yan from India to Singapore. Yan ang expertise nila. Ginaya lang ng mga Kastila. Actually, isa pa yon. Pag tiningnan mo yung mga policies ng mga Kastila, halos kinopya nila yung British model. So doon mo makita na they were learning from each other. Na nakikita natin, ito yung effective po sa kanila. And I think one historian na pwedeng hahanapan ng ganong klaseng conclusion would be Philippa Levine. She talks about this, that the British were so concerned about the health of their military na talagang they tried to legalize prostitution so that they could regulate it. I don't know about the Dutch, no, pero yun yung lumalabas. So those are two cases, no, na pwede, na possibility. And manilimutan ako na senior moment ako eh. May sabihin pa sana ako. I'll try to remember. I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks, Marco.
Thank you. Welcome.
So,
ayun pala. Yung gusto ko rin isingit. Sinabi ni James Warren, siya yung advisor ko, medyo unusual ang Pilipinas kasi ang mga colonies sa Southeast Asia, nag-start sila very lax sa prostitutes or sex workers. Then eventually, naging very brutal sila and very restrictive yung pag-legalize. Kasi sobrang yun, talagang physically, ma-violate ka ng mga procedures eh. Sa Pilipinas daw ang weird. Maharahas sila sa umpisa, din yung huli, parang sumuko na lang sila. Tapos sabi ko, tinanong niya nga ako, sigurado ka pa dyan? Sir, sigurado ako dyan kasi yung nasa dokumento, in fact, sinabi nga ng isang historian, si De Beauvoir, tayo lang ang may record ng prostitutes na ganyan ka-complex. Na may 4 bundles ata ang archives na nandun yung mga kwento, etc. etc. Tayo lang talaga. And doon nga pinapakita na nung tumatagal, parang napagod sila or nakita nila, wala nang way para i-manage to, wala tayong enough personnel, bayaan mo na.
I just wanted to comment on that, no? Kasi that's so curious given na parang if you look at the lockdown, di ba ganun din yung sa ng government, at the start, very strict, right? So that was the
Ningas kugon, no?
That was the reaction of the government na very strict. Afterwards, parang sige na, pabayaan nila, let them go. We can't help them anyway. I mean, we can't do anything about it anyway. So curious lang na it's a pattern that repeats itself.
Pero a quick follow-up question lang doon, Marco. Wala kayang kinalaman yung revolution doon? Na because, the resources of the Spanish government were quite stretched, fighting the Filipino revolt. Kaya hinayaan na lang niya na i-tolerate yung mga ganong activities.
Actually, possible yan. Para kasi ang gusto ko lang din i-share, and actually na-realize ko lang po, nakakaya, parang I've been studying history for so long, for 20 plus years na, tapos ngayon ko lang ma-realize to. Meron tayong, the Spaniards at that time, noong 1890s, had very active and violent campaigns, military campaigns in Mindanao noong time na yon. So, ang dami talaga nila mga sundalo. In fact, sa maraming mga asuntos kriminales na reports na may mga babae na nahuli na doing sex work, marami sa mga kasama nila yon, mga sundalo. Marami ganun. Nakakahiyang, nakakaawa. Actually, pag nagbasa ka ng documents, malulungkot ka rin eh. Baka yun din ang isang dahilan kung bakit ang dami na kasing, kaya naging mas lax sila. And then siguro yung revolution pa, and again, they had soldiers. Na-stretch talaga sila. Pero going back to what Nina said, no, actually totoo, and I don't think it's just the Philippines. I think it's a reflection of a weak state. Diba? Na when you don't have the personnel, the institutions, or the moral, no, to do it. Like ang bawa ngayon, nung nagkaroon ng lockdown, recently, nagka-lockdown ulit, sa Marcos Highway, grabe yung PNP. Ngayon, pumunta ulit ako sa mag-anak ko, kita ko yung diferensya. Ngayon wala na, wala nang traffic. Pinalaya na kami kaagad. Di na nga tingnan ang pagbumuka namin, etc. etc. Wala na. Yeah. Yes.
Bon, you had a question, I think.
Ay, oo. So, pwede mag-dalawa or isa lang?
Sure. Kayo ba?
May tagi-isang question for.
Sige, for both of them? Sure. Yeah.
So, yung kay Marco, yung question, kasi dami Marco, diba, yung parang historical study as a historian, maaari bang makita kung ano yung may data ba tayo na makikita kung ano din yung experiences ng itong mga women na to?
Yes.
Regulated by the states. And ang reading ba niya is in a way posible bang, are they resistant or maabilidad? Is there a way na parang may lumalabas ganung pattern of positioning dun sa mga babae?
Meron, pero mas nalimuot at malungkot.
Yeah.
Parang, I'll give 2 examples. Yung isa, labandera siya sa Marikina. Malayo ng Marikina po noon, ha? Malayo na siya. Pumunta siyang Maynila para maghanap ng trabaho. Kasi yun ang lumabas sa police report eh. Pumunta po ako ng Maynila para maghanap ng trabaho. Wala po ako mahanap na trabaho. Kailangan ko ng trabaho. Pinasok ko to. Kasi meron akong anak. Maiyak ka talaga. Yung isa naman, ito yung worse. Merong isa na yung case ay nahuli sila. Marami sila, nahuli sila. Nung pinalaya sila, nag-volunteer siya. Nag-volunteer po ako na dalhin niyo na ako sa isang agricultural colony. Tapos tinanong siya, bakit? Ang dahilan po ay wala na kasi akong buhay rito. Wala na akong mababalikan. Wala akong ikabubuhay pa. Dalhin niyo na ako sa Palawan. Nag-apila siya. And there were also letters of appeal din pala of women who were about to go to Palawan. Tapos nakikiusap yung mga nanay nila na, kawawa naman ang anak ko, pagbigyan na ninyo. Mabait na bata siya. Tapos ito, parang makikita mo yung ibang side. Sa history, ang tawag dyan, reading through the cracks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So parang yun, pero syempre, it also requires a bit of imagination, so may bias. I must admit.
Oh, kasi wala na, no? Hindi mo na siya, yung live experiences na talaga. But very interesting. Salamat.
Thank you.
Yung question ko kay Kai, kasi often may tension talaga with ethics in practice and bureaucratic ethics, and often hindi covered sa bureaucratic ethics yung issues ng situated yung ethics in practice. May challenges ka bang na-encounter or paano mo yun na-navigate in terms dun sa participatory research ng mga babae?
Challenges in ethics. I mean, for me kasi I understand ethics is something that's, always unfolding as you encounter, women. So in terms of institutional ethics, you can always tick the box. Okay, I've already done my informed consent, etc., etc. But for me, kasi usually sabi nila, one-off na informed consent. But for me, I really made sure na it's continuous. So parang, bakit ka pa pabalik-balik? Sabi na, pwede kayong mag-back out anytime, okay pa ba? Ganun. So it's something that I was quite conscious of, and really yung trauma was one thing that I struggled also to address. I was afraid that, you know, you're gonna be opening floodgates of emotions. Ang fresh pa ng Yolanda during that time. I entered, I think, mga 4 years after. And a lot of them, sa umpisa, umiiyak talaga. So parang my own reflections also, like, ano ba itong ginagawa ko? Parang am I re-traumatizing them or something like that. But later on, yun nga, yung sinasabi ng yung mga participants na parang, we thought that kinalimutan na kami, no, yung ganon. And there's also that other side of the coin that they do want to tell their stories din. So parang how to do it in a sensitive way din, na you don't appear, you know, exploiting that suffering, you know, because you know Yolanda is a disaster that has launched 1,000 PhDs. So how do you not? So how do you not?
You can even probably convene an international conference on Yolanda impacts in Tacloban. And then,
yeah, and yung one thing that really got to me was yung may na friend kasi ako na community organizer doon na he was lamenting about how these, you know, international researchers came in, you know, stayed in hotels for 2 weeks, conducted research, and then, you know, lo and behold, naging eksperto na. So it was a struggle for me as well. I mean, that doesn't appear in ethics monitoring. It's basically iba kasi yung ethics monitoring, but that's why I think it's very important to always continue that reflexivity. Dahil sa ginawa ko, how I operationalize that, meron akong, well, I have field notes, pero meron din akong own diary, which I call a reflexivity diary, which where I really documented these particular ethical issues that I encountered, how I felt, and the discomforts that and it helped me navigate through those feelings and work with, you know, I do not want to, you know, para claim I am so ethical, because, but I think that discomfort is good.
Yeah.
Because it keeps you on your toes and keeps you thinking.
Thank you.
I hope that answered your question.
Kasi iniisip ko lang din yun eh. Kasi marami ang nagsabi na institutional ethics is not enough. Kasi tick the boxes lang talaga siya. Walang follow-up kung ano nangyayari sa communities.
Iba talaga, because every year sa UNSW, and I think it's the same for everyone, may monitoring, annual monitoring ng ethics, diba? And basically, the questions that are being asked are just, are there modifications to your methods? And if there are modifications to the method, so what are the ethical considerations? And for me, it's very limiting, because it does not really capture that encounter between research and researcher, as well as what occurs beyond that particular research. Hindi siya makakapture sa institutional ethics processes.
okay, thanks, Kaira. Anyone else? Question or feedback? I have another question for Kaira. Yung issue nung, I know that you were able to conduct a series of feedbacking sessions with the communities and the women in several communities. But did you get the chance to present some of your findings with local government officials? And if you did get a chance, how did they respond to some of the unsettling insights?
That's one of the unfortunate things I wasn't able. There was the plan. There was certainly a plan to have that, but I was there for a very limited time, and it's actually very difficult to organize something. You know, you bring them all together, and of course there were other personal circumstances that happened, which you know, required me to leave the fee before I will sa plan ko. So yeah. So unfortunately, that wasn't able to materialize. But yeah, there was that second plan ko sana na babalik ako with that exhibit, and I wanted to actually invite you know, officials at saka yung mga kahit sa barangay or city, and as well as program implementers. Pero yun nga, travel became restricted, so hindi na uli nag-materialize, unfortunately.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. We still have 3 minutes left. Come on, guys. Alex, Erica.
Tayo lang naman.
Yeah.
Thank you pala dun sa, alam ko, network yata ito ng mostly educators.
Yeah, thanks
Nasa
for
Philippines. Thank you for joining us. Marco, pwede kaya, yung ano mo ba, yung study mo, kasama na ba yan sa curriculum?
Baka may textbook na si Marco dyan.
Textbook na ba yan? May
Sorry,
textbook na ba? Nasa curriculum na ba yung study mo?
Naku, wala pa. Wala. Actually, wala pa naman atang ganong klaseng plano.
Ay, si Erica.
I think Erica had a question or feedback.
Or, yeah, I'm not sure kung nakausap ka na si Kaira before about the PhotoKwento, but it was something that I was already interested in before kasi nga it intersects a bit with what I'm doing in eco-fiction. So, ang gandang reminder nung ganong yung, well, even though I'm not doing ethnography or immersing, nandun pa rin yung part and parcel din kasi nung methodology ko yung ganong self-reflexivity ng scholarly voice, yung how do you question yung the inherent power imbalances or yung those kinds of negotiations of identity that you do when you take on a scholarly voice. So interesting din to know na you're keeping two different dalawa yung record keeping na ginagawa mo, yung one is yung what did you call it, yung reflexivity
Reflexivity diary.
Reflexivity diary. So it's interesting to see that from a different researcher's perspective kasi parang I'm also trying to negotiate that in my own work din eh. And sobrang interesting discussion ni Sir Marco about yung about the dangerous women. So as someone na interested sa feminist themes,
Thank you.
so I'm always really fascinated by yung gantong actual archival work that appends yung imahe natin ng Pilipinang kababaihan, especially during these times. Yung you know how parang people have this preconceived notion ng of Victorian Moors, and na parang medyo nakikita din natin yun sa parang may preconceived notions, maraming may preconceived notions about that. So parang
yung Maria Clara image.
Yes.
Yeah. And which is interesting kasi Maria Clara was not was written precisely as a reaction against that image of mahinhin na babae, because Maria Clara was not diba? So really that was really insightful. It was great to see all those specific details from your archival work.
Okay. Actually, maraming salamat, Erica. Katunayan, women from all walks of life, even the propertied ones, actually, makikita mo yung mga women who filed for separation, may mga documents wherein women who own businesses, sold properties. Ang dami talaga na makikita mo na ang hirap mag-generalize ng kababaihan. Isa pa yun eh. Maraming uri ng babae. No? Pero kung meron mang consistent ay women in Manila, then and now, they've always been part of its development. They've always been part of its social and economic spaces. And we should do justice to them. Na hindi sila napapansin masyado na in the process of city building, maraming pong nagagawa yung mga kababayan talaga. Thank you.
Parang ang vibrant nga ng Manila noon as a metropolis, small metropolis at that time. If you just look at the archival facts.
Yes.
Okay.
May comment
maybe
pala
one
daw on the chat function.
from Ma'am Raquel. Ma'am Raquel, I agree.
Hindi ako
Madami
yan.
so,
Sabi niya,
from Ma'am Raquel. Ma'am Raquel, do you want to read it out?
Pero sadly, sorry.
Sige, basahin ko na lang. Sana po maisama sa curriculum ang study ni Dr. Marco. Panahon na rin po para malaman ng lahat at hindi lang ng iilan.
Actually po, ang first step talaga is kailangan ipaglaban natin na ibalik ang history as a course for all grades.
Yes.
As a core subject for all grades. Kasi right now, it's just grade 6, grade 4, parang ilan lang po talaga. And kahit sa for example, sa UP, no? CAS 1 is required, pero kung titingnan mo mabuti, CAS 1 is not enough. Kasi nga, di ba, when you teach History 1 or Philippine History, bihira ka naman umabot hanggang sa panahon ni Marcos, di ba? Yun nga yung dahilan, sabi nga na baka nga isa yun sa dahilan kung bakit talaga yung mga tao are not so familiar with what happened during martial law, etc. Pero thank you. Sana nga talaga, pero I think ang kailangan talaga is even more space, more. It needs more airtime. History needs more airtime sa K-12.
So yung mga educators na